in the North, and the realization that racism was not just a Southern phenomenon, but was a national experiment, and that black people were at the brunt of that, and that there was no illusion that you would ever be able to engage in the American dream. And the result of that is that black people were drawn disproportionately to radicalism and to rebellious behavior to fight back against those conditions. The 1930s and the 1940s foreshadowed that, and in the 1960s it boiled over in an absolutely unprecedented way. From 1963 to 1968, more than 500,000 African Americans engaged in open rebellion in the United States. In almost 300 cities, there were uprisings of black people across the country. That number, 500,000, was almost the same number of troops that were in Vietnam. So we're not talking about a marginal number of people. We're talking about a significant number of the black population. And when the U.S. government commissioned a report to figure out why are all these what they called civil disorders happening, the three things that they went and interviewed people in 200 cities, and the three things that kept being repeated were unemployment, substandard housing, and police brutality. And that, in every riotous situation, that was the spark that lit the fuse that had been that came together around all of these other issues. But it wasn't just the riots that made the American state fearful. It was the rise of radical politics and organization that struck the most fear. The politics of Martin Luther King, the politics of Malcolm X, of the Black Panthers, and a whole slew of other radical organizations that emerged in this period, that all of whom in different ways came to raise larger questions about the nature of American society and what it was, and why is it that black people, whether you were in the South or in the North, could not just get ahead in American society. And those were the questions that compelled J. Edgar Hoover and the state to declare that the black movement was the greatest internal threat to the security of the United States. 10% of the population declared, and the movement against racism declared as the greatest threat to the internal security of the United States. And that's why they killed all of the black leaders, because they didn't want a black movement to be sustained during that. And so out of the 1960s, the two things that came out of that was, one, they knew that they had to let a small group of black people get ahead so that you wouldn't keep having these sort of rebellious outbreaks. You had to create some examples that proved that the United States was good. The examples that finally culminated in, having a black president in 2008. While at the same time, the vast majority of black people continue to live in conditions of deprivation. But the other part of that, the second thing to come out, was that for those that they considered to be what one writer has called social dynamite, for those that they considered to be the sort of fodder of radicalism and rebellious behavior, they were going to get prisons, police brutality, harassment, and really be those who they considered not able to be absorbed and integrated into society, that they were going to be completely marginalized. And that is why, the prisons, I was at a meeting a couple of weeks ago, and someone said, oh, the prisons just, the prisons were just made for, just for prison's sake. It's like, no, the prisons were made for the aftermath of the black movement. And that is when the prison industrial complex escalated and took off. Was, in the rubble, really, of the black freedom struggle of the 1960s. The prisons were the response. The prisons and mass incarceration and the rise of an internal police state in black communities was the response to that. And so what that means for today is, in some ways, we obviously continue to face the same historic problems that were identified in the 1960s, that were identified in the 40s and the 30s. Unemployment, underemployment, poor schools that are underfunded and segregated, substandard housing that we overpay for, so on and so forth, and all of the disparities that have historically defined black life in the United States. And just like 40 years ago, it's not like the 60s, but just like then, in terms of what is happening now, is the emergence of political struggle and organizing against it. And which is not to say that that's new. I mean, when I lived here in the 1990s, you know, people were struggling and organizing against police brutality because it's an ongoing feature of black life in cities across this country. The difference in what is happening now is that it's coinciding with a larger upsurge of political activism and movement, most exemplified by the Occupy movement. Right. But we can see how these two things intersect with each other when, you know, for the first 4 or 5 days of Occupy, it wasn't clear what was going to happen with this, where it was going to go, but the execution of Troy Davis and the outcry in New York and across the country in response to that showed how both the struggle against the economic inequality that is exemplified by the Occupy movement can intersect with the struggle against racial inequality. Because we know in the United States that you can't have economic inequality, you can't talk about economic inequality without talking about racial inequality as well. In a general sense, but on a very basic level. Because for every dollar that they spend on putting more cops on the street, building prisons, and the whole network of the criminal justice system takes money out of all of our schools, all of our hospitals, all housing programs, all of the social programs across this country. That money is taken out of that to pay for this police state. And so that really is the challenge that we face. That is the task of our movement right now, is not only at the center of it is challenging and campaigning against the stop and frisk, opposing the new Jim Crow, standing up to every example of police brutality and murder that happens in every city across this country, and really beginning to develop and pull together the sort of networks that people up here have talked about are necessary to challenge it. Because I don't think that it's just a question of people are lazy or asleep or tired or anything. People are afraid. The police are acting like terrorists. You know, like it's in the old South. What they, you know, what the racists would do was they called it hang a nigger on a tree. KKK. That you hang one to set an example for everyone else. So Oscar Grant did talk back. Oscar Grant in Oakland had the nerve to talk back. And what did they do? They laid him face down and shot him in the back. And that's what happens to you if you talk back. And that is the lesson that they want people to draw, so that people are afraid to say anything. Not because they don't know what's going on, they're lazy, they're asleep, or they're tired. They are afraid of getting shot. They are afraid of what is going to happen to their family if they dare to say anything against the police. And the only way that we cut against that is to build our movement publicly, is to build demonstrations, speak outs, to come out and force to the police board hearings, to show that we are not isolated, we are not alone, and that we will respond to this collectively as a community, as a network of activists, to every instance of police harassment and brutality, so that they know that they won't be able to get away with this in the dark of night. That was the strength of the movement in the 1960s, the Black Panthers in particular, who showed up and walked around and patrolled the police, and that had a direct impact on the police's ability to feel like they were free to go around and harass people individually. We have to break through the atomization that the police thrive on, and the feeling of isolation and being alone.